Say you had a glass of water tonight. I saw somebody behind you lean over and slip a little cyanide capsule into it. Happen to know what they did. And I see you pick up that glass of water and start to go like this. And I just sit there and smile at you. I don't say a word. I don't intervene. I don't do a thing to the person, nor do I say, I just do nothing. I just step away from the situation. That caused you harm. Caused you big time harm. Not by intervention, but by no intervention. The present phase of God's wrath, He gives it up. He doesn't come in with a miracle and stop it. He steps back. If humanity doesn't want Him, He lets them continue to digress and self-destruct from the inside and therefore be worthy of the judgment of God and retribution. Let's see what happens here. Let's see the first phase of God's present wrath. Once they religiously pervert Him, look at verse 24. Romans 1 and verse 24. It says, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. We see here in their rebellion, God steps back and He just lets them live like beasts and just live by the lust of their hearts. And with bodily perversion, and then there's a reversal of truth in verse 25. They change the truth of God into a lie. And they start to put more emphasis on the creation than the Creator. And they look at the creation as their source of life. And now it's all about the creation rather than the Creator. And they reverse the truth. They take the truth of God and change it into a lie. You know, Isaiah had to preach against that in Isaiah 5:20. He said, woe unto them that put darkness for light, and light for darkness, and evil for good, and good for evil, and bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter. Where they take this values, what was once wrong is now right. It's liberty, it's your rights. And what was once right, that's bigoted, that's biased. And you see, they change the truth of God into a lie. God gives them up, and when He does that, the present phase of God's wrath, you can look for bodily perversion of the lust of the body and so on. And the emphasis will be more on the human body and creation and all that than the Creator. Well, when they do that, God steps back further. They reverse the truth. Now look at verse 26. They go into ravishing appetites in their rebellion. Ravishing appetites. Look at verse 26 and 27. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, or even their women, to change the natural usage of that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. It'll come right back to their body, and God says they deserve it. The present retribution of God and so on. And so they're given up to ravishing appetites, not only the body, but now vile affections. Vile affections. And we see the men with men and women with women, and burning in lust, giving bodily consequences back to them, which is meat. And so we see God steps back and doesn't come in with some miracle answer to it all. He lets them begin to self-destruct from within. And so the reversal of truth to ravishing appetites. And then there's one more phase to God stepping back of His present wrath. Look at verse 28. Verse 28. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. You see, the cause is not God. The cause was them. They did not like to retain God in their knowledge. You know what the most attractive feature of evolution is? It's not its logic, because there is none. Okay? The most attractive feature, it doesn't account for a personal God. And it can say, somehow we got here without a God who was spoken into existence. Therefore, I can sin and kind of feel good about myself. I don't have to live in guilt and misery. I can enjoy life, and no one can judge me. And that's the most attractive feature of it. They don't want God in their knowledge. And they love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. The Lord Jesus preached when He was on earth in John 3:19. This is the condemnation. The light has come into the world. And men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. And so we see it's no God. And they don't want God. You know what God does then? It was the body. It was the affections of the soul. And now it's the mind. He gives them over to a reprobate mind. You do know what a reprobate mind is. Some translation will have depraved, and that's a true word also. Reprobate means incapable of moral judgment, incapable of discerning, no longer able to distinguish logically between right and wrong. Wrong will seem right, right will seem wrong, and the mind doesn't have the ability. It might be a professor, a doctor, it doesn't have the ability to discern what harms and what doesn't harm. The mind is gone, it's handicapped, as we say today. And it gives them over to a reprobate mind to do things which aren't convenient, and so they think all these things are their rights, and verse 29 says they're filled with them. You know what happens? Well, that was verse 32. Who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. They will be worthy of the coming judgment of God. Retribution is deserved. It's a punishment that's real. It's not reformation that he's preaching here. It's not toleration that he's preaching here in the name of love. It's judgment that he's preaching. This message is salvation. They need to be saved. They have no excuse. They can't say, I didn't know there was a God, because creation said there was. And so we see them in all this darkness and all this depravity and all this ignorance. And we say, poor people, God will certainly make exception for them. How'd they get there? When they knew God, they glorified him not as God. They need a Savior because they're under the judgment of God. Now, having said that, as I look at the audience tonight, I think the majority of you, like myself, that we have seen Romans 1 come true, the order of Romans 1, in our very society, in Western society. And I remind you of what happened. I remember, I lived then. In the late 1950s, I'd go to school, and there I would see a textbook that says, I got here because God created me. One year I went back, and the textbook said, I got here from a monkey, and there's nothing about God in it. And there was a national, on a common level anyway, there was a national rejection of God in creation by Western society. Now, when that happens, what did Romans say will follow? There will be symptoms that follow: rationalization. And as I said, they just didn't take God out of the textbook and skip the subject. They told me I got here from a monkey, or evolution. And there was rationalization. Rationalization set in. Then we began to hear words in the late 1960s like New Age movement, the religion of the East. There was nothing new about it. But they say, we all have the Christ consciousness in us, and New Age, and we just got to learn to release them, and things like that. We began to imagine that man was God. We were all Christ. And they religiously perverted God. And one of the charms and idols and things like that, the New Age movement, it only became a popular term in the late 1960s. That will follow rationalization. And you know what else happened in the 1960s, our society as a whole? Well, there was the rebellion of bodily lust, wasn't there? They called it the sexual revolution. About the time the Beatles came over to America, I can remember it was like hitting a light switch. Suddenly people say there's nothing wrong with living together, and everything changed, at least on the surface, in a year or two. And they were given to bodily lust, and they were reversing the truth. You know what else happened around that time? We started to put more emphasis on creation than the Creator. And you heard things like Earth Day, and we got to save the planet. Today it's called global warming. And people look at our Earth as a source of life, rather than God, the source of the earth. And the rejection of God, they got to save the planet because they don't think it can survive because they don't believe in God. You start to hear things like Earth Day and save the planet. I saw when that started. And that is the exact symptom that you're under the present phase of God's wrath. Then in the early 1970s, as God further steps back, guess what happened next? Exactly what verses 26 and 27 said. We saw lesbianism and homosexuality. The gays came out of the closet, and there was no more shame. And it started to become acceptable. And we saw that happen in the 1970s. And then you started to hear about diseases that you never heard before. AIDS, STDs, herpes. Different diseases became popular and rampant, affecting the very body. And God said down, "Don't be pure from heaven, no man strives." He said it was me. And so you saw the ravishing appetites. And then the final phase of God's wrath is verse 28. He gives them over to a reprobate mind.